your video on off if you don't want to be seen, but we will be showing speaker view in the recording, so I think that you should be fine. As you enter our Zoom, I invite you to just take a moment to transition from your busy day fully into this space, taking a few deep breaths to center yourself and connect with all the women and men here online. And imagine ourselves as a beautiful chain of care for the earth stretching all around Australia and the world. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all elders from around Australia and indeed from around the world. And I particularly welcome all the First Nations people who are on this call today. In a minute, I'm going to ask our 4 amazing guests to briefly acknowledge and welcome us to their country in their own preferred way. But first, I'm just going to introduce our purposes here briefly and introduce our guests to you. While I'm doing this, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and you can put in your country and where you're joining from. We do have people joining us from all over Australia, as I mentioned, and from a number of other parts in the world as well. So we're very excited about that we're going international tonight. These conversations create a space for openness among women to explore feminist perspectives on climate change and to build community around women's voices and leadership. We're very pleased that this event today is also part of the National Sustainable Living Festival. And we thank the festival for their support and welcome all of those who came to us tonight through their programme. This year, we're particularly framing our conversations around our Women's Climate Congress, Charter for Change. The Charter is a call for action from the hearts of women in all our diversity to urgently secure the climate and build ongoing human and planetary well-being. To this end, we urge collaboration and cooperation in governance to build inclusive and fair and united policy approaches. And there is a lot of relevance in our charter for the conversation we're going to have tonight, and I hope maybe I can come back to it a little bit later. Let's see how we go. But I think Nettie's going to put the link to the charter, which is on our website, in the chat, so you could go and look at it there. In this online conversation, we're going to explore the recent historic ruling of the Queensland Land Court, who recommended against approval of Clive Palmer's proposed Waratah Coal Mine, a new mega thermal coal mine that was proposed to be built on the Bimblebox Nature Reserve, a pristine sanctuary of about 8,000 hectares on Wangan and Jagalingou country in the Galilee Basin. And the basis of the recommendation against the mine was that it would contribute to climate change impacts, which would limit the right to life, the cultural rights of First Nations people, and the rights of children, the rights of property and privacy and home, and the right to enjoy human rights equally. So as I mentioned, we've got 4 wonderful conversationalists with us today, and I'm just going to briefly introduce you. Their full bios has been in our publicity and is on our website, so I'll just briefly introduce them. We've got Lala Gutchen, who we're very excited is joining us from her ancestral homeland on Erub Island in Zenadth Kes, that is the Torres Strait, and she is an Erub Meuram Woman from that island. So it's a huge privilege to have you with us tonight, Lala. And Lala was one of the witnesses in the case against the Waratah Mine, and in a historic first gave evidence on country in accordance with her traditional protocols, and we're going to hear more about that as we go along. Patricia Julien, maybe you can wave as I introduce you, is the secretary for the Bimblebox Alliance, and was part of the legal communications team for the Alliance with the Environmental Defender's Office, and I'll introduce that in a minute. She has a background in physical geography and microbiology and rangeland, hydrology and ecology, so she was very well qualified to be involved in the environmental impacts on that country, and she'll be talking more about that as we go along. And again, we're very, very privileged to have with us Murrawah Johnson, who is a Wirdi woman from Wangan and Jagalingou country. And she is the co-director of First Nations program lead at Youth Verdict, who was the other group who brought the case against the mine on behalf of many young people in Queensland. And she's also a spokesperson of the Wangan and Jagalingou traditional owners family council, and she's well known both in the UN and around the world for her long-standing work with First Nations self-determination and justice. So again, it's a huge privilege to have Murrawah here tonight. And finally, Alison Rose, who is also a Women's Climate Congress Steering Circle member, is a senior solicitor within the Safe Climate, Coal and Human Rights team working with the Environmental Defenders Office. And she was the lead solicitor for the Waratah Mine coal mine case. So it's fabulous to have you with us, Alison, and to have you with the Women's Climate Congress. So with that, I'm going to ask each of our four members, as I said, just briefly to say hello, to bring their voice into this space, and to welcome Acknowledged Country in their preferred way. So I'm not sure, Lala, would you like to start?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Lala Gutchen. I am coming live from Erub Island in the Zenadth Kes. Before I would like to start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this area, the Erub Sunset people on the ground that I'm sitting on right now. It belongs to my ancestor grandmother. Also, I would like to acknowledge your ancestors and all of you all from around the world joining us this evening. Well, it's evening here where I am. And yes, it's an honor to be on here to share my story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you, Murrawah, would you like to?
Sure. Molly. Hello, my name is Murrawah. As it's already been said by Janet, I'm a Wirdi woman. I'm related to pretty much everybody between Brisbane and Townsville, if you are familiar with Queensland geography. But I come from the Birragubba Nation, and just acknowledging that I'm not living on my own land at the moment, but a lot of the coal mines have been on my country. I'm acknowledging that I am coming to you from Jabgai Nation lands up here in Creda in Far North Queensland.
Thank you. Patricia, would you like to say hello? Oh, you're on mute, Patricia. Oh, you're on mute. Can you turn off your mute?
Is it how is it now?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, sorry about that. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Yubera people from Mackay, Central Queensland. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. And Alison.
Yeah, thank you very much, Janet. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm staying on the unceded country of the Turrbal people in Meanjin, Brisbane, north of the Meanjin River, and that this territory is unceded, and acknowledge ancestors past, present and emerging. And look forward to speaking with everyone tonight and sharing with some of our story and the background of the case and why it's important. So thank you and welcome everyone.
Thank you. So with that, I'm going to toss to Alison to sort of take over talking to the other guests, because Ali knows a lot about this case and she can direct the conversation. We're going to have two sort of segments. The first one's going to be sort of about the case and the evidence, which was very groundbreaking in its own way. And then after about half an hour of that, we're going to look at the ruling and the precedent that sets and what that might mean for our movements. And I've asked, I should have actually mentioned in the housekeeping up front that we did, when we had our pre-meeting on Friday, we thought this is going to be such an interesting conversation, it might be hard to contain it within the 1 hour. And I did put around in the emails that have gone out that we were going to keep going until 8:45 or 7:45 if you're in Queensland, or some other time if you're somewhere else, but a quarter of an hour later than we originally said, just to give us a little bit of extra time to get some Q&A happening. So do put your questions in the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye on that. So if I'm looking to one side, it's because I'm looking at the chat, and we'll see if we can bring that in a little bit as we go along. Okay, Ali, I'm going to pass over to you to go with the first section.
Thanks very much, Janet. Yeah, so wow, this was a huge case, incredible from many different perspectives. The Environmental Defenders Office started looking at the Galilee Basin, I guess, first about 8 years ago, maybe even longer than that. But obviously, sort of coming in quite late to the piece compared to the Wangan and Jagalingou people who have been protecting the area for, you know, since time immemorial. And in developing, I guess, in looking at this case, one of the key things was that, so the Galilee Basin is a huge area, a huge coal deposit in central Queensland near Emerald and Alpha. This particular mine was proposed by Clive Palmer, everyone's favourite Queenslander, and it's you know, part of a very large area of the Galilee Basin, and the mine was proposed, the coal mine was proposed to mine about 40 million tonnes of thermal coal per annum, commencing from about 2025 originally, and then running until about 2050. So obviously at a time when we really can't afford to be mining coal. And it was also proposed on Wangan and Jagalingou country, but on an area that has been maintained as a nature refuge, the Bimblebox Nature Refuge, for about 20 years. So it's a really important, culturally significant area, and also a really important and significant area for biodiversity conservation as well. And the Bimblebox Nature Refuge, if you've ever had the pleasure of going out there, is quite beautiful. And as is, you know, the whole of Wangan and Jagalingou country, it's beautiful desert country, and you know, and home to many different species of animals and plants. And the Bimblebox Nature Refuge itself is particularly important, and I'd love Patricia to sort of speak to that a little bit more as well. Tonight, I think it would be really great, because it's such a huge case, it's really difficult to cover everything, but I think the significant aspect of the way that the case was developed, and also the ultimate judgment, was in the way that the people who are protecting Queensland and the environment, and for everyone, and the way that human rights were sort of raised in the case and treated in the judgment were really significant. Queensland has only had a Human Rights Act since 2019, and this was one of the very first cases that tested the application of the Human Rights Act. And originally we were looking at different sorts of legal arguments that could be raised to try and, I guess, look at how we could protect, you know, against coal mining, the impacts of climate change, and raise those important issues in the Land Court within a human rights frame. So looking at the impacts of climate change on the rights of children, of young people, and in particular the cultural rights of First Nations people. And very early on in the case design, Murrawah was instrumental in working and looking at how to develop and frame the case as a First Nations first case, and also Lala, in the way that Lala presented her evidence. And we, worked very hard early on in sort of designing the case to really present important First Nations evidence on the scientific, like the evidence about climate impacts on country, and we discussed really how to present that evidence to the court so that the court could really understand and hear about the impacts firsthand from the people most qualified to describe those impacts and explain them, I guess, and the intricate network of all of those impacts, and what is actually going on out here, not just on one particular country, but on all different sorts of countries in Queensland in particular, because that's the jurisdiction we're working in. So I guess where we're at this point is that we won the decision. The decision was successful. So we succeeded in getting a recommendation for refusal. That recommendation then now goes to the Minister for consideration on the mining lease and also the Environmental Authority, whether or not those things will be granted. They almost always the Minister, well, in every case so far, the Minister for Resources and the Department of Environment have followed the Land Court's recommendation. So we don't expect them to depart from it, but it is a separate decision and they have to also exercise their independent, decision-making capacity in making that decision. There was an appeal in the Supreme Court of the Land Court's decision. However, that was actually discontinued a week and a half ago, much to our excitement and joy. And, we can only take from that Clive Palmer was terrified of our arguments and didn't want to take us on again. But, it's a really significant case, I think, from the perspective of, like, the amount of incredible science that was presented in the case on biodiversity offsets, on impacts, on country, on climate impacts, from First Nations people, that was very deep and significant evidence. There was also, Western scientists that gave evidence as well, and that really supported the First Nations evidence in lots of ways. And, it was connected. And I think the other significant aspect was that along the way, there were a number of different quite groundbreaking decisions. So first of all, Waratah applied to strike out the human rights grounds and was unsuccessful. The Land Court decided that it was a public entity and was required to comply with the Human Rights Act and to make its decisions, in accordance with the Human Rights Act. That then included taking on country evidence and taking evidence in a way that accorded with the first law protocols of the people giving witness evidence in the case. So that sort of thread was really consistent throughout, and those judgments were also incredibly significant in terms of procedural gains in Queensland, in the jurisdiction here. So one of the fantastic things about the Queensland jurisdiction is that any person can challenge a thermal coal mine approval, an application by objecting to it in the Land Court. And those objections then have to be heard as a merits review where evidence can be led and a decision made about the actual impacts of the case. That's unusual. No other jurisdiction does that. And then we also have a Human Rights Act. So it's a really neat and very helpful framing for running these really important cases. And we think that, while not binding precedent, because it's a Land Court judgment, so it's a lower court, it is likely to be the sort of judgment that that will make it difficult for future coal mines to get approval, because those legal principles will stand. So that's sort of like, I guess, the legal boring wrap up. But what I'd really like to create sort of a lot of space for now is for Lala, such an amazing opportunity to have Lala and Murrawah both on the call together to talk about the way the case, the sort of the groundbreaking sort of aspects of the case. And perhaps Lala, if you could sort of kick off by sharing perhaps why you decided to become involved in the case and gave, such an enormous contribution of evidence on the climate impacts and cultural impacts of climate change on your country.
Okay. Well, as growing up on an island, as a born and bred islander, I saw these changes happening when I was young. And we thought it was like, oh, something different's going on. So then ended up we got educated about it. It's like, oh yeah, this climate change, global warmings. Then we didn't know what was the cause of it. So as I grew older, I kept on tracking everything with my elderly parents, because most my knowledge comes from my parents, my elderly father and my mother. So I heard them saying this, oh, it's not normal, something's going on. So as I grew older, I knew, I found out that the one main cause of climate change is coal. So I studied more about it, and then eventually, as I grew older, I was like, oh, one day I want to speak about it, but I just didn't know how to. And we were talking amongst our people, saying all these different, effects happening on the island, affecting our season times. Those are our practices that we practice. We don't use technology to tell us what time to fish, what time to garden and stuff. All of it's cultural practices that's been passed on from our ancestors until now. And then all of a sudden this case came up, and I thought about it, and I was like, maybe it's our time to speak up. So I got myself involved, and I said I want to support the court case and give as much First Nation evidence I know about my country and what are the effects on my country happening right now. So that's how I began involved, and I'm still pushing for it because I live on a volcanic island, so it's one of 5 other volcanic islands in the Torres Strait. It's more to the east, and mine is a bit bigger, but our low-lying villages are being affected by climate change, the sea level is rising. And our ancient fish trap that was built for thousands, God knows how many years, but it's been there since, I don't know, our ancestors been there. So we still use those fish trap. Now we can't use those because the sea level is rise, the tides are playing up. So that's some of our culture is dying off, and because of this. So that's how I get involved, and it made me angry, the fact that people can do that and destroy other people's cultural practices. Everybody has our cultural practices, and mine been affected more. Right now, it's the season in a normal. So that's how I got involved in 2020 when Murrawah contacted me, and I said, well, this is my time to shine. And I spoke to my parents, and I try to get the young people. So most of my mob now are educated about it, and they know what's the main cause of it. So we call it the giz, meaning the root of the problem. And yeah, that's how I got involved with the court case. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lala. And it was incredible. It's an incredible involvement. Just to sort of explain a little bit more, the judge came out to Lala's country and took evidence on country. And Lala's family, we went out on boats and was very incredibly generous, and we're very, the court was very privileged to be taken out and shown a lot of the country and some of those impacts, and firsthand And yeah, I mean, it was a very significant thing. I think when people are, see things for themselves, and those things are like the impacts are explained to them by knowledge holders, and the significance of that and how dire the situation is. And, it is life-changing, I think. It's not something that you can see and feel or touch and not be moved and changed by that. And sometimes, you really do need to be taken out of your frame, which is like a courtroom for lawyers, and put straight into the place where the impacts are to really understand what's going on. So yeah, it'd be, perhaps Murrawah, would you be able to just sort of, I guess, explain a little bit about, why you got involved and how you developed the case theory as well from the start?
Oh wow, that's a lot.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's exciting. Thank you again, everybody, for having me on, and acknowledging also Ali and Patricia and Annie Lala. So yes, so as I said before, I'm a Wirdi person, but I also come from Wangan and Jagalingou country. I actually come from the eastern side, which is Wangan country, which is a part of the Wirdi dialect of the broader Birragubba Nation. And then more to the west, I guess we're a joint claim group for native title purposes, but also a lot of our old people married in together, I think, at the point of frontier conflict and colonization on our land. And so we kind of all huddled together, and that's how you get everybody descending from one side or from both sides of that country. And so just acknowledging that it's not directly my country, but it's my family, all of my mob, and as a council in my time as a spokesperson, we as decided to move forward in unity, and that regardless of what side of the country we came from, we could speak out, because really it's a systematic problem that affects our people. And we have the most beautiful country, but unfortunately it's rich in high-grade thermal coal. And so for decades, our people have been the sacrificed people. Everybody else has profited off of our loss. And so really my training started with the Wangan and Jagalingou Family Council, and really standing up against the Adani Carmichael coal mine with my mob. And it became very clear throughout the 8 years of our family council campaign, and I guess the litigation track in challenging Adani, that Queensland, but particularly at that time working with the Native Title Act, which is a federal act, the legislation in Australia just isn't up to standard in terms of human rights and also First Nations rights. The Native Title Act and a lot of legislation that specifically applies to First Nations people has been found to be racially discriminatory by international bodies such as the UN. And so I guess it starts all from there, and that, we ran, in my time with the Family Council, over 8 years, we ran 6 legal cases, and we had grounds, and our arguments were strong, but the way that the legislation is written, it facilitates certain outcomes, and those outcomes are never, I guess, in the benefit of our people. And so I was contacted by one of the lawyers from EDO. There's this Clive Palmer mega coal mine, which is like so much bigger than Adani, proposed also on Wangan and Jagalingou country. And initially asked me to be a witness, but really, I think this was the time to sort of shift my role and develop my own skills a little bit in terms of advocating for First Nations rights within the Western legal system. We know that the legal system isn't designed to work for us, but I think that where we can push it and challenge it against its own standards, or bring in international standards, then I really want to be a part of that work. And so that's kind of what got me involved with the court case. And initially where the case redesign happened and where it shifted. So originally, yes, youth verdict. We are a co-objector with the Bimblebox Alliance. And so we're one of the clients on the case who took the case up. Where we spent a lot of time talking about, okay, if environmental cases don't win and First Nations cases don't win, what are we going to do? And so what happened was, okay, how can we use this tool, the Queensland Human Rights Act, to, I guess, run this court case in a way where we can level the playing field a little bit, where we can, our arguments can be heard, and I guess more weight and value can be given those arguments. And so, we wanted to put really strong evidence forward, and to make that evidence of climate change really strong, one, we had to go where climate change was happening, but also we had to make sure that the evidence didn't just come from there, that the decision makers as well had to go and see firsthand the places and the people that are impacted by the decisions that they make when they decide to approve a mining lease or decide to approve an environmental authority approval. And so youth verdict, we've come a long way from the initial filing of the case 3 years ago. And while we're not exclusively a First Nations organisation, we're mostly made up of younger women from all diverse backgrounds, but decided that, especially in the Australian context and with Australia's commitment to coal, which we believe is synonymous with the commitment to the colonial project and the maintenance of the colonial apparatus, we understand that the future that all younger generations, all young people stand to inherit really depends on whether justice is realised by First Nations people or not. Because when First Nations people have decision-making power, agency and control over what happens on country, we have a safer and healthier climate for everybody. And so that's a little bit about, I'm happy to talk a bit more later. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, 100%. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thanks, Murrawah. Yes, Patricia, we throw to you, and then and why Bimblebox, the Bimblebox Alliance, what you've been doing and what you're protecting.
Okay, thanks. In around 2000, there was a lot of land clearing going on, especially clearing of trees for grazing purposes in the Jericho sub-bioregion of the desert uplands. And a property called Glen Innes was up for sale, and people who were concerned about the loss of biodiversity in the region knew it was in excellent condition and tried to raise funds to buy the property. They were pointed in the direction of the National Reserve System for protected areas, and that the Commonwealth Government had funding, and the government provided about about two-thirds of the funding to buy the property, on the condition that it be made a nature refuge, and also on the condition that it be managed to a basically world-class standard, which was an IUCN Category 4. Most of the nature refuges in Queensland, which are privately owned, are managed to an IUCN Class 6, which is not as stringent as a Class 4. So what that actually essentially did was mean for the last 20-odd years, it's been very carefully managed by Ian Hock, Paola Cassoni's partner, and it's turned out to be in the best condition in the desert uplands. It's been recognised as being in excellent conditions for its environmental values. Most of the property, about 97%, was in had never been cleared, so that helped as well. When they learned it was going to be mined in 2007, the exploration found coal there. Paula started a campaign. She gathered a lot of supporters, and over time they grew and grew and grew. And we had a lobbying campaign. We did everything we could think of to bring attention to social media, webpage, newsletters, videos, whatever we could do, fundraise as well to try and address the issue, because protected areas under the National Reserve system are not supposed, they're supposed to be permanently protected. They're not really supposed to be mined, although the legislation allows for mining, but only on the condition that you don't harm the values for which the nature refuge was created. Now, when it was gazetted as a nature refuge, that meant that all of the values, all of the environmental and cultural values within the nature refuge were protected. So if you were going to try and mine it, you'd have to find an offset that would match or be even better than those values. And that turned out not to be the case. It came out in the court case with expert witnesses that no, they couldn't find a match. Now, that was a bloody hard job. Digging into that and finding that information, a lot of work by a lot of people, a lot of effort, ongoing surveys by experts in their field of the flora and fauna, found over 650 flora and fauna species, everything we could do, species of high conservation significance for that nature refuge. We had most of them there for the bioregion. So there was plenty of evidence, and it was accepted by the court and even the opposition that, yes, it was in excellent condition and it'd be hard to find a match. And that was one of the reasons that the judge decided that the offset probably didn't exist. So that's about, I'd like to mention also the, in 2014, the Coordinator General for Queensland, who looks at these large-scale developments, around December of that 2013, said, "Oh, it's going to be approved as a mining project. It's gone through the EIS assessment and it's going to be mined, and there will be an offset at the time." But they never did get it, of course. But following that, a very pretty much exhausted but enraged Paula decided that we would form the Bimblebox Alliance. And we quickly gathered a lot of support for that. It's totally volunteers, all of us, even the management committee. And the goal was to have permanent protection of environmental and cultural values of nature refuges and other protected areas in Australia, and within the reserve system of protected areas. Now, the reserve system of protected areas is governed by the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that's an international convention. So if you can't find an offset, because legally they brought in offsets in Queensland after that, if you can't find an offset, then you're in violation of that Convention on Biological Diversity. So it was really a no-brainer that really this mine should not proceed. So that gives you some background on it. Okay. Any questions?
Ali, it might be relevant here because it's in relation to the environmental evidence, but there's a question come up in the chat from Kirsten, which says, what's the relationship between this case and Tanya Plibersek's recent refusal of the permit for in central Queensland?
They're both protected areas. The Great Barrier Reef is of national environmental significance. Bimblebox is of state level of significance for biodiversity. And they're both under threat from both Palmer projects, actually, but the two mining projects that expert advice said cannot be mitigated from the damage that would be caused. So the damage would be too significant in both cases for the project to proceed. So we're hoping that the mining minister and the environment minister in Queensland agree with that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I'll just add to that that was a federal, so Plibisec's decision
Yes.
was a federal decision, and under the EPBC Act, and the state decision on that particular mine, which is the Styx coal project, quite close to the coast, that it doesn't proceed. So it didn't get as far in the approval process as this particular one, the Galilee coal project. It's much smaller, and it was essentially opposed by the state government. They probably went about as far as they could to oppose it, including the Transport Department opposed it because Clive was actually proposing to shut down the Bruce Highway once a month so that he could blast either side of it. So,
and his
PMR was like, oh, I don't think so. So that was it was quite a ludicrous proposal, really, and they didn't, it didn't stack up. It wasn't viable on Clive's own figures.
Any level,
so so it was quite, it's quite similar in lots of ways. But yeah, Janet, did you want to?
Yeah, so I thought maybe we could segue now into thinking about the ruling and the precedent that sets. Just before doing that, I just want to mention, I didn't mention up front, but it relates to the wonderful climate science evidence that there was in this case. And I want to just make special mention to remember Will Stephan, who, of course, we're very sad has passed away in the last month. And I wanted to this occasion tonight to be sort of in memory of him, because his climate evidence was very pivotal in this case, as it was in many other cases and situations where he just consistently put it out there. But I think of him as a great knowledge holder in our culture, our settler culture, and an elder in that sense because of the type of person he was. And so I think we just take a moment to remember him and his wonderful contribution. So in relation to the outcome, I mentioned earlier that the ruling says that it was on the grounds of the climate science and the climate impacts that the science indicated, and also the right to life, cultural rights of First Nations people, the rights of children, the rights of property and privacy in home, and the right to enjoy human rights equally. And all of those things are things that are sort of captured in our Women's Climate Congress Charter. And I'm intrigued to think, I would love to hear the responses of all of the panel about the judgment and whether they were surprised by it, what it means to them, what it means to their communities, and what sort of precedent it sets, and also how this maybe sets the ground for what influences decision makers up the line, like Tanya Plibisek say, to make the decisions that they do, and how these sorts of cases and having values like our charter, might helps that along. So I'll go back to Ali and she can set the scene.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think the role and the impact on the work that we're all doing as well, kind of moving forward. For us, it's sort of the legal impact, and that's reasonably obvious. It makes it a lot easier for us now to put in, to assist clients to run really good sound objections, and also potentially to challenge, to support our clients to challenge coal mining approvals at a federal level as well. So it is very significant in that respect. A lot of the reasoning can be equally applied to any coal mine. The client science and substitution reasoning and the decision around that Scope 3 impacts can be considered, and that they also, are a factor that weighs against a mine being approved because it's not in the public interest is really significant, I think. And in Queensland, the fact that the burning of coal anywhere in the world does have a material impact on climate change because of the remaining carbon budget. So it's a material component of that, amount of coal that's left, or the emissions that can be burnt as part of that carbon budget, which I think is really significant. So those aspects are really key, and of course on offsets as well. And the offsets aspect of it, I think, was a key target of the strategy, because often offsets are used to, to justify the complete destruction of an area, and those offsets are never realised. And so there isn't really any ever net, a net gain. And so the offsets expert, Professor Martine Maron, did a fantastic job of breaking down, I guess, the illogicality of the offsets program and debunking a lot of the myths, because she is essentially the world's leading expert on offsets. And so it was an incredible opportunity to educate the court about, a huge number of things, but, including First Nations rights and culture, climate impacts, and the substitution argument. And, a lot of the evidence on climate was actually agreed to, I should add. So Waratah's own experts were agreed with our experts in a lot of very key elements. So they agreed that the offsets, for example, for Bimblebox were manifestly inadequate, which is an incredible concession from a mining offsets expert. And they also agreed that if the coal was dug up and then burnt overseas or anywhere in the world, that it would contribute to climate change impacts. And the climate change impacts that we were saying, including the rights on First Nations people, their argument, though, was that that didn't really matter because the Land Court wasn't able to consider that. It wasn't a relevant consideration because the Land Court's job isn't to determine what people do overseas, and in any event, even if it could, another mine somewhere else would just produce that coal, and so there would be no net benefit if the mine wasn't approved. And ultimately, the judge found that that was not correct, and that was based on their evidence, because Waratah was unable to provide the court with evidence that there would be perfect substitution, or that there was even a likelihood of substitution, perfect substitution. They also found their expert, who is works for Wood Mackenzie, is one of the leading coal market modelers in Australia and advisors. Their own expert from Wood Mackenzie agreed that if the coal from the mine was burnt and if perfect substitution did exist in the market, then we would actually be in a world of 2.7 degrees of warming at least, and potentially up to 8.5 degrees. So for their hypothesis to hold true, that perfect substitution, the market could perfectly substitute the coal, they needed, we would be in a world of 2.7 degrees, and they agreed with that. So that was incredibly significant, and some of those concessions led to, I guess, the ultimate decision. And there wasn't, I know there's a question just here in the question section, that was there sort of any one aspect of the case that was determinative? And I would say that that President Kingham was very careful, the Land Court was very careful at ensuring that no one aspect of that particular of her decision was determinative, but it was all of those things together. But in any event, it was, it could be one, but even without it, it would still be her decision based on the balance of the evidence. So it was sort of, I guess, all of the evidence, the bulk of the evidence that led to the Land Court deciding that it was not in the public interest to recommend approval of the mine. But I think you could think of it as a concept of like it was refused on its direct impacts. So the impacts on, the Bimblebox Nature Refuge and the local area, and then also the indirect impacts, the climate change impacts. And that was also how the case was really developed from a legal sense and a scientific perspective. But yeah, it'd be great. Now, Murrawah, perhaps, and Lala, you could speak to the impact that I'm really interested in, I guess, is the impact that you see the case may have, on your work moving forward in protecting country, Lala, and on your community, and the way that you explain, I guess, impacts and your work in protecting, your culture and country, and Murrawah, I guess, in the work that you're doing to really raise the profile of all of the work that you do. But I think it's better if you explain that than if I try to paraphrase it. So, Murrawah, perhaps would you like to go first, or?
Yeah, yes, please. Sorry. Just really quickly, because I zoned out halfway through speaking the last time I spoke. I probably forgot the most important part, which was the case redesign. So everything I talked about plus, obviously, so First Nations justice, I think, is the determining factor in, and that's globally, the determining factor in whether we actually can, we have the necessary drastic shift in our attitudes, values, and beliefs, and really, I think, shift towards justice for First Nations people. And I think through that process, we have to have necessary conversations that we have to make us move to allow us to move forward. I think, in the spirit of protection of our collective future. And so why the case is different, and why this human rights test case is different from youth verdict perspective, really quickly, is just that, originally there was a very youth focus to the case, and as sort of the front of the case, and the change with the case redesign was shifting that and saying, well, we're still a youth organisation, youth verdict. We're mostly young people, but are we the people with the best knowledge and the best evidence of climate change? No, we're not, because we haven't been here as long as old generations have. Our elders are the holders of the knowledge. Our elders have observed country for decades. Our elders understand our legal and our law systems and our customs. And so we really wanted to highlight climate change and the impacts of climate change, the negative impacts through, I guess, intergenerational storytelling. So how has country changed from generation? And so Lala's family is a perfect example of that. Obviously Akanate, her parents, and then also Anilala, and then also her daughter and nieces and the other children on the islands as well. How is culture being lost in that transfer, because there are certain things that you can't do anymore because we're limited because of the impacts of climate change? And so we'd said we need to put old knowledge at the forefront of this and really privilege that. And so Youth Verdict made an active decision to have exclusively First Nations witnesses, and rather than a combination of non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people, trying to evidence climate change on country,
we lost
So
her.
that's why we decided to have exclusively First Nations witnesses. And also hello,
Yeah. No, you're
hi.
good. You're good.
Am I in and out? Sorry.
No, you're good. You're
There's
good.
probably like 50 people on the Wi-Fi here in this one place. Yeah, really quickly, rather than sort of like having Section 28, which is the cultural rights section of the Queensland Human Rights Act, rather than having, you know, a mixture of First Nations and non-Indigenous people and sort of like a whole bunch of different arguments, you know. So, for example, non-Indigenous people could evidence the cultural rights, the specific cultural rights of First Nations people. So we didn't want to have a sort of, I guess, an inconsistent cohort of evidence and knowledge and witnesses that we were putting forward. And so where we kind of came to is, well, culture and the cultural rights of First Nations people are so important, because every other aspect of the right to life and all of the other rights, even right to privacy was mentioned also in the decision, rights of a child, all of these things are lived through our cultural rights. We realise and practice all of our other human rights through our culture. And so that's why we decided to put the cultural rights for youth verdict, cultural rights at the top, and through the evidence of our witnesses, be able to prove that all of the other rights will be impacted if the cultural rights of First Nations people are impacted. And it's so obvious and clear when you take the court to where climate change is already happening, where the impacts are so obvious that they're irrefutable. And I think that was really the core part of our case that for youth verdict really brought it home. Really quickly, sorry, just remind me again about this question. It's about the decision and what other impacts we hope to have in the future. I think, well, essentially, a little bit bummed that we didn't get to make the decision stand in a higher court, in the Supreme Court. At the moment,
Yes.
it still sits as a recommendation, and you know, we definitely put so much thought into how we were gonna give really strong cultural evidence. Like, it's not enough, pardon me, just to have Indigenous people pushed in front of this. It has to actually be strong evidence from cultural knowledge holders, people who have strong relationship with country and with their family and with their people, who are able to, I guess, bring that evidence and that expertise into the frame of the court through this case. And so it's really important because for so long, the human rights of First Nations people and our rights over the environment and our environmental law, which is the law of this land, which has been here since time immemorial, then integrated for so long, as well as our land rights. And so what I really saw this case as, in terms of having sort of all of the evidence fall underneath cultural rights for our First Nations witnesses. I think that this case was really a way of marrying those things back together, where they haven't been married together, you know, at a legal sort of level for a long, long time, because there have been successive, you know, government policies that have worked to dispossess First Nations people, not just of our land and our families, but also of our traditional ownership, our responsibility and duty to make decisions about country, which is the first environmental law. And so in terms of my hopes with what maybe some other impacts of this case will be, is that other First Nations people, I guess, can find confidence, hopefully, in the fact that there are, I guess, the legal system in terms of objecting to a mining application Hopefully it's made a little bit easier in terms of them being able to give evidence and having that evidence done on country and concurrently, so it's not necessarily going against our protocols and what's appropriate about who holds knowledge and who can share knowledge. But if it can be done in a group, then you know, there's more support from the people, but also it's more true a representation of the people as well. And hopefully, you know, we were prepared to go to the High Court. I think that there's, you know, we'll see what happens in the future, because while the legal sort of process for this particular case is done now, with Clive Palmer and Waratah withdrawing their appeal, but I don't think that this work is finished. There's a lot more that needs to happen, and the next thing is sorts of direct impacts, and that's going to be send shock through the mining industry. So stand by.
Thanks, Mara. Lala, are you able to, would you mind speaking to, I guess, the impact that the case may have had on your work and so on? Thank you.
You guys can hear me, or?
Yeah.
Is it clear? Yeah. Well, like for me as a First Nation person, it was really good to actually challenge the court with First Nation people rights, so they could know, like, we have rights as First Nation people. And like for me, through my kinship and protocols and ancestral rights, we have the obligation to care for country, whether it's on black and white or what, but it's part of our cultural practices. So talking about country, caring for country, it's a right that we can't push aside from us. It's at the forefront for us. So like for me, as with this case, it opened my mind so much in continuing on, like especially going against something that will contribute to destroying my rights, where I have an obligation to like care for country. So for me, like for going forward and stuff is like as Mara was saying, we're ready for it. Like if there's something come up, I will keep on going, like, because in the end my parents won't be here, I won't be here, so it's passing on the knowledge onto my daughter, so they will continue the fight to care for country and for our culture, especially our culture, like our cultural identity. I work as a language worker and I've been battling two ways. So I'm trying to revive my first language and I'm copying climate change at the same time. So it's a two-way street for me, and doing anything that will reduce the risk of destroying my cultural identity is everything that we will take on board. Like when I first told my parents that I will be giving evidence for a very big court case that will object a coal mine application, my father encouraged me and said, I will put evidence too as well to support, because we've seen the changes over the years and now you've witnessed the changes, and then it will go on to your daughter, to your descendants. So me as a First Nation person, I have the right to care for my country. And when I'm gone, it's for the next person. It's an ongoing fight for us. So like Mara was saying, when we got the decision in November, they filed for an appeal to the Supreme Court. We wasn't worried because we knew that we outrun them in the first round, so we were going for the second. And when they, withdraw from the court case, it was a happy moment for the community too as well. I've got a lot of good feedback from my people from all around Torres Strait, especially my Aboriginal family on the mainland. They've thanked me and others. So it's a continuous fight for us as First Nation people. So, yeah.
But that's actually a little bit related, Lala, to a question that's come in online here from Kasaya, who says, are there any unique challenges or opportunities you faced as a youth advocate specifically?
I faced a lot of it as a woman because I come speaking from a fisherman perspective. I gave most of my evidence on sea country. I practiced a lot of navigation and moon tides, and those were affected in the last 10 years of fishing. So I've been, talked into using a sound or GPS to, be an alternative thing if my cultural practices can't work, but I've refused to do that because it's my people way of knowing when to fish and when to hunt. So I've been challenged a lot as a woman, but I've been known in my community to be a strong fisherman and a cultural person, and these were all knowledge that were passed on from my father onto me and to my siblings, and I took on that role, and that's why I could give evidence in court to say that my sea country has been affected with coral bleaching, dying coral, and the fish moved on, and we fish at different tides now. So that was the main one, and my others were based on gardening. So we do a lot of gardening. Those were the, things that I got asked why talk about it, but it is really important because we still live off the land and the sea. Even though we were, people civilized now, they wear clothes and stuff. Our cultural practices is still practiced within our community, and our people, our tribe still hold on to it. So that was one of the things I faced as a young mother. I'm a mother of one daughter, so I got asked, why do you care? I said, I do care because that's what I was born into this world for. I have that job to do. So, yeah.
Nurture of life. Yeah.
Yeah, so right now I know it's going to be an ongoing challenge for me because I've reached the age now that I'm in my 30s, and I have younger women behind me that are following my footstep, and older women before me. They have carried on what we've done in the last few years, and they're willing to take that stand together with us women to continue the fight. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Lala.
Yeah. So who's next?
Mara, would you like to perhaps speak to the role of women as well, in youth verdict and some of the work that you're looking to do now as a result of sort of the casework?
Sorry, I just cut out for 1 second there. Speaking to the role of women, something, and then in the context of the casework, and I think it was probably the most important part.
I think the role of women was the most important part.
Yeah, the role of women in youth verdict, I think, and the role that you see sort of for women moving forward too, and the work that you're doing.
Good ways. I think my journey. So I first got involved with standing up for my mob in 2014. I was 19 at the time, and a lot of, I think, my personal challenges have been that I come from a patriarchal law system, and so but it's not necessarily our law that's the problem. I think it's the colonial subversion of it that creates a male superiority complex, and so every step of the way, I think get in where you can fit in, and so no disrespect to our men, but the colonial apparatus is pervasive, and where we have patriarchal law, that doesn't necessarily mean that men sit on top or there's an equality between the genders. It just means that way that our who we are, so our place within our society, we get it. So we follow a skin law, like kinship system, made up of 4 parts, and you get your skin. So who you are within the group, who you're related to, who you can marry, who you can speak to, what you eat, what you don't eat, every single aspect of your life, essentially, where you're born, like which part of country you're born in, where you're buried, who can dance at your funeral. Everything is dictated by this skin system, who you are, who your parents are. And so for us, it works that we get it from, we're told who we are by, we're the same as our father's father. And a lot of the time, I think, where there are First Nations law systems like that, unfortunately, being on the East Coast, we, there has been a lot of, I guess, colonial, sort of twisting of what it actually means to have patriarchal law. And so I've always been outspoken, and I'm one of 20 children. I have 9 sisters, but very even. But also it's too often, I think, standing up for country has been designated for men, whereas for us, the whole skin group. There's a whole skin group, my skin group, that are the warriors. And so it's not just the men, it's the women in that skin group too. But unfortunately, we've forgotten that. I think doing this work for me, I think, from, colonial outposts all around the world.
Might have lost a little bit of connection there with Murrawah's internet, shall we? We're getting very much towards, here we go. We're back. We just broke up for a moment there, but
I think we may have lost Murrawah again.
Yeah.
Janet, you're on mute now too.
Sorry that I dropped out there, but I'm happy to leave it there and just say that the women are always leading the fight. Women are always leading the fight, and the more we push back against the colonial apparatus, the more positive change we can have in terms of addressing climate change, but also equalising, I think, the role of men and women, and also bringing it back to the fact that we're the for the most part, sorry, not to be too binary or exclusionary, but we bear children, and so really the womb is the first country, and so it's through our women standing up that our children learn to stand up for country. It's where they get their first country, and so that's me.
Tricia, I wondered whether you might have, I think it was Tricia. You're on mute, Tricia.
Unmute. I should be on now, right?
Yeah.
You can hear me now?
I can hear you now, but we're getting towards the end of our time. So
I just wanted to say that women have the communication and networking skills, which is so important, and they also want to ensure the future of the human race to continue. So they're big reasons for people to get involved and protect the environment. And I'd also wanted to say that the Human Rights Act has given landowners who have the responsibility for protecting places of high value now the power to even the odds a little bit more, and that has been missing dreadfully in the past.
Yeah.
So they're the main things I wanted to say. Ryan?
Thank you. Thanks. I think, given the time, I would very much like to thank all of our conversationalists tonight for it. I think it's been a wonderful conversation. We left it on a note there where there's another whole lot of wonderful stuff to unpack, but we will have to come back to that another time. So thank you very much. I think we can do our Zoom thanking everybody, and thank you, Ali, for taking us through those two segments so marvellously. I was actually going to share a screen to just show you a couple of events we've had coming up, but I can't make it happen and it's getting late, so I'll just tell you we're actually running a series of events this year about our Charter for Change. You've got the link to the Charter for Change in the chat, and the first two events are in Tasmania, and I think, well, I'll get Nettie to put up links to them if you're still there. There's two events in Tasmania coming up, and then we're going to have one in Newcastle in April as well, and these are all you'll be able to find these events from our website, so please look out for those. Yeah, Nettie's just put the link there right in the bottom of the chat to our events page on our intranet actually. And do please join the Women's Climate Congress on our website. There's a join us thing that'll put you on our mailing list to get our next events and initiatives that we're working on, and we'd love to see you there. So once again, thank you everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for our conversationalists, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thanks for organising. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks.